This is the drug question list for the clinical social work exam. If you have not seen the previous video on the drug study list, I recommend that you review that video before reviewing this video. 3 questions will be asked. What is the generic name? What is the class or type of drug? And what does it treat? What is the generic name for Haldol? What class of drug is Haldol? What does Haldol treat? The generic name for Haldol is haloperidol. It is a typical antipsychotic and treats schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for haldol-decanate? What type of drug is haldol-decanate? What does haldol-decanate treat? Haloperidol is the generic name for haldol-decanate. Haloperidol is a typical antipsychotic. It treats schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for loxetine? What type of drug is loxetine? What does loxetine treat? The generic name for loxetine is loxapine. Loxetine and loxapine are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for Mellaril? What class of drug is Mellaril? What does Mellaril treat? The generic name for Mellaril is Thorazine. Mellaril and Thorazine are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for Mobon? What type of drug is Mobon? What does Mobon treat? The generic name for Mobon is Molindon. Mobon and Molindon are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for Navane? What class of drug is Navane? What does Navane treat? The generic name for Navane is thiothiazine. Navane and thiothiazine are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for prolixin? What type of drug is prolixin? What does prolixin treat? The generic name for prolixin is fluvoxamine. Prolixin and fluvoxamine are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for Surmontil? What type of drug is Surmontil? What does Surmontil treat? The generic name for Surmontil is mesoridazine. Surmontil and mesoridazine are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for stelazine? What class of drug is stelazine? What does stelazine treat? The generic name for stelazine is trifluoperazine. Stelazine and trifluoperazine are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for Thorazine? What type of drug is Thorazine? What does Thorazine treat? The generic name for Thorazine is chlorpromazine. Thorazine and chlorpromazine are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for trilofan? What type of drug is trilofan? What does trilofan treat? The generic name for trilofan is phenelzine. Trilofan and phenelzine are typical antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for Abilify? What type of drug is Abilify? What does Abilify treat? The generic name for Abilify is aripiprazole. Aripiprazole. Abilify and aripiprazole are atypical, which are second generation, antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for Clozaril? What type of drug is Clozaril? What does Clozaril treat? The generic name for Clozaril is clozapine. Clozaril and clozapine are atypical antipsychotics, second generation. There is an increased risk of agranulocytosis that requires blood monitoring. Clozaril and clozapine treat schizophrenia and mania. What is the generic name for Geodon? What type of drug is Geodon? What does Geodon treat? The generic name for Geodon is ziprasidone. Geodon and ziprasidone are atypical second-generation antipsychotics. They treat schizophrenia and mania. Ziprasidone and Geodon are serotonin dopamine antagonists. What is the generic name for Risperdal? What type of drug is Risperdal? What does Risperdal treat? The generic name for Risperdal is risperidone. Risperidol and risperidone are atypical second-generation antipsychotics. Risperidol and risperidone treat schizophrenia and mania. They are serotonin dopamine antagonists. What is the generic name for Seroquel? What type of drug is Seroquel? What does Seroquel treat? The generic name for Seroquel is quetiapine. Seroquel and quetiapine are atypical second-generation antipsychotics. Seroquel and quetiapine treat schizophrenia and mania. They are serotonin dopamine antagonists. What is the generic name for Zyprexa? What type of drug is Zyprexa? What does Zyprexa treat? The generic name for Zyprexa is olanzapine. Zyprexa and olanzapine are atypical second-generation antipsychotics. Zyprexa and olanzapine are serotonin dopamine antagonists. What is the generic name for Depakene? What type of drug is Depakene? What does Depakene treat? The generic name for Depakene is valproic acid. Valproic acid and Depakene are anti-manic agents. They are mood stabilizers. What is the generic name for Depakote sprinkles? What type of drug is Depakote sprinkles? What does Depakote sprinkles treat? The generic name for Depakote sprinkles is divalproic sodium. Depakote sprinkles and divalproic sodium are anti-manic agents. They are mood stabilizers. What is the generic name for Lamictal? What type of drug is Lamictal? What does Lamictal treat? The generic name for Lamictal is lamotrigine. Lamictal and lamotrigine are anti-manic agents, mood stabilizers. What is the generic name for Escitalopram and lithobid? What type of drug is escitalopram and lithobid? What does escitalopram and lithobid treat? The generic name for escitalopram and lithobid is lithium carbonate. Escitalopram and lithobid and lithium are anti-manic agents. They are mood stabilizers. There's a narrow therapeutic index that necessitates periodic checks of blood levels and periodically checking thyroid and kidney function. What is the generic name for Tegretol and carbatrol? What type of drug is Tegretol and carbatrol? What does Tegretol and carbatrol treat? The generic name for Tegretol and carbatrol is carbamazepine. Tegretol and carbamazepine are anti-manic agents. They are mood stabilizers. What is the generic name for Topamax? What type of drug is Topamax? What does Topamax treat? The generic name for Topamax is topiramate. Topamax and topiramate are anti-manic agents. They are mood stabilizers. What is the generic name for Celexa? What type of drug is Celexa? What does Celexa treat? The generic name for Celexa is citalopram. Celexa and citalopram are SSRI antidepressants. What is the generic name for Lexapro? What type of drug is Lexapro? What does Lexapro treat? The generic name for Lexapro is escitalopram. Lexapro and escitalopram are SSRI antidepressants. What is the generic name for Luvox? What type of drug is Luvox? What does Luvox treat? The generic name for Luvox is fluvoxamine. Luvox and fluvoxamine are SSRI antidepressants. What is the generic name for Paxil? What type of drug is Paxil? What does Paxil treat? The generic name for Paxil is paroxetine. Paxil and paroxetine are SSRI antidepressants. What is the generic name for Prozac? What type of drug is Prozac? What does Prozac treat? The generic name for Prozac is fluoxetine. Prozac and fluoxetine are SSRI antidepressants. What is the generic name for Zoloft? What type of drug is Zoloft? What does Zoloft treat? The generic name for Zoloft is sertraline. Zoloft and sertraline are SSRI antidepressants. What is the generic name for Anafranil? What type of drug is Anafranil? What does Anafranil treat? The generic name for Anafranil is clomipramine. Anafranil and clomipramine are tricyclic antidepressants. These may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Ascendin? What type of drug is Ascendin? What does Ascendin treat? The generic name for Ascendin is amoxapine. Ascendin and amoxapine are tricyclic antidepressants. They may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Elavil? What type of drug is Elavil? What does Elavil treat? The generic name for Elavil is amitriptyline. Elavil and amitriptyline are tricyclic antidepressants. They may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Norpramin? What type of drug is Norpramin? What does Norpramin treat? The generic name for Norpramin is desipramine. Norpramin and desipramine are tricyclic antidepressants. They may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Pamelor? What type of drug is Pamelor? What does Pamelor treat? The generic name for Pamelor is nortriptyline. Pamelor and nortriptyline. Pamelor and nortriptyline are tricyclic antidepressants. They may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Sinequan? What type of drug is Sinequan? What does Sinequan treat? The generic name for Sinequan is doxepin. Sinequan and doxepin are tricyclic antidepressants. They may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Surmontil? What type of drug is Surmontil? What does Surmontil treat? The generic name for Surmontil is trimipramine. Surmontil and trimipramine are tricyclic antidepressants. Surmontil and trimipramine may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Anafranil? What type of drug is Anafranil? What does Anafranil treat? The generic name for Anafranil is imipramine. Anafranil and imipramine are tricyclic antidepressants. Anafranil and imipramine may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Vivactil? What type of drug is Vivactil? What does Vivactil treat? The generic name for Vivactil is protriptyline. Vivactil and protriptyline are tricyclic antidepressants. Vivactil and protriptyline may be used for the treatment of other conditions. What is the generic name for Nardil? What type of drug is Nardil? What does Nardil treat? The generic name for Nardil is phenelzine. Nardil and phenelzine are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They are antidepressants. Nardil and phenelzine have dietary restrictions of foods that contain high levels of tyramine. What is the generic name for Parnate? What type of drug is Parnate? What does Parnate treat? The generic name for Parnate is tranylcypromine. Tranylcypromine. Parnate and tranylcypromine are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They are antidepressants. Parnate and tranylcypromine have dietary restrictions of foods that contain high levels of tyramine. What is the generic name for Desiril? What type of drug is Desiril? What does Desiril treat? The generic name for Desiril is trazodone. Desiril and trazodone are SARI SARI antidepressants, SARI. They're serotonin receptor antagonists and reuptake inhibitors. They're not a true SSRI, but share many properties of the SSRI. So Deserel and Trazodone are SARIs, antidepressants. What is a generic name for Effexor? What type of drug is Effexor? What does Effexor treat? The generic name for Effexor is venlafaxine. Effexor and venlafaxine are SSNRI antidepressants. SSNRI stands for selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Effexor and venlafaxine are SSNRI antidepressants. What is the generic name for Remeron? What type of drug is Remeron? What does Remeron treat? The generic name for Remeron is mirtazapine. Remeron and mirtazapine are tetracyclic antidepressants. Remeron and mirtazapine are still not fully understood in how they work. What is a generic name for Surzone? What type of drug is Surzone? What does Surzone treat? The generic name for Surzone is nifazodone. Surzone and nifazodone are phenylpiperazine class antidepressants. Surzone and nifazodone are not chemically similar to the other groups of antidepressants. What is the generic name for Wellbutrin? What type of drug is Wellbutrin? What does Wellbutrin treat? The generic name for Wellbutrin is bupropion. Wellbutrin and bupropion are a miscellaneous antidepressant. The Zyban brand is used to help people stop smoking. What is the generic name for Ativan? What type of drug is Ativan? What does Ativan treat? The generic name for Ativan is lorazepam. Ativan and lorazepam are benzodiazepines, which are also used for other conditions and has a high abuse potential. Their use are anti-anxiety. Ativan and lorazepam. What is the generic name for Buspar? What type of drug is Buspar? What does Buspar treat? The generic name for Buspar is buspirone. Buspar and buspirone are miscellaneous anxiolytics, sedatives, and hypnotics. Buspar and buspirone are anti-anxiety medications. Buspar and buspirone have a warning not to use if taking an MAO inhibitor. What is the generic name for Klonopin? What type of drug is Klonopin? What does Klonopin treat? The generic name for Klonopin is clonazepam. Clonazepam. Klonopin and clonazepam are benzodiazepines, which are also used for other conditions, has a high abuse potential, is used for anti-anxiety. Klonopin and clonazepam are used for anti-anxiety. What is a generic name for Valium? What type of drug is Valium, and what does Valium treat? The generic name for Valium is diazepam. Valium and diazepam are anti-anxiety medications. Valium and diazepam are benzodiazepines, which are also used for other conditions and has a high abuse potential. What is the generic name for Xanax? What type of drug is Xanax? What does Xanax treat? The generic name for Xanax is alprazolam. Xanax and alprazolam are anti-anxiety medications. Xanax and alprazolam are benzodiazepine, which are also used for other conditions and have a high abuse potential. What is the generic name for Adderall? What type of drug is Adderall used for? What type of drug is Adderall, and what does Adderall treat? The generic name for Adderall is amphetamine and mixed salts. Adderall and amphetamine and mixed salts are used, they're stimulants, and they're used to treat ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. What is the generic name for Concerta and Metadate and Ritalin? What type of drug is Concerta and Metadate and Ritalin? What does Concerta and Metadate and Ritalin treat? The generic name for Concerta and Metadate and Ritalin is methylphenidate. Concerta, Metadate, Ritalin, and methylphenidate are stimulants. They treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. What is the generic name for Dexedrine and Dexedrine Spaniels? What type of drug is Dexedrine and Dexedrine Spaniels? What does dexedrine and dexedrine spaniels treat? The generic name for dexedrine and dexedrine spaniels is dextroamphetamine. Dexedrine spaniels and dextroamphetamine are stimulants used to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. What is the generic name for Advair discus? What type of drug is Advair discus? What does Advair discus treat? The generic name for Advair discus is fluticasone salmeterol. Advair discus and fluticasone salmeterol are bronchodilators. They're used to treat asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. What is the generic name for Crestor? What type of drug is Crestor? What does Crestor treat? The generic name for Crestor is rosuvastatin. Crestor and rosuvastatin are statins. Crestor and rosuvastatin are lipid-lowering agents. What is the generic name for Cymbalta? What type of drug is Cymbalta? What does Cymbalta treat? The generic name for Cymbalta is duloxetine. Cymbalta and duloxetine are serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SSNRI. Cymbalta and duloxetine treat depression, anxiety, osteoarthritis pain, and fibromyalgia. What is the generic name for Diovan? What type of drug is Diovan? What does Diovan treat? The generic name for Diovan is valsartan. Diovan and valsartan are angiotensin receptor blockers. Diovan and valsartan are used to treat heart disease and heart failure. What is the generic name for Hysingla and Zohydro? What type of drug is Hysingla ER and Zohydro ER? What does Hysingla ER and Zohydro ER treat? The generic name for Hysingla ER and Zohydro ER is hydrocodone. Hysingla ER and Zohydro ER and hydrocodone are narcotic analgesics, antitussives. Hysingla ER and Zohydro ER and hydrocodone are opioid pain medications, also used to stop and prevent coughs. They are also habit forming. What is the generic name for Tylenol? What type of drug is Tylenol? What does Tylenol treat? The generic name for Tylenol is acetaminophen. Tylenol and acetaminophen are analgesics. Tylenol and acetaminophen are pain relievers and fever reducers. What is the generic name for Synthroid? What type of drug is Synthroid? What does Synthroid treat? The generic name for Synthroid is levothyroxine. Synthroid and levothyroxine is a thyroid medication drug. Synthroid and levothyroxine treat hypothyroidism and used to shrink the thyroid gland for people who have thyroid cancer. It's a synthetic thyroid hormone. What is the generic name of Lantus? What type of drug is Lantus? What does Lantus treat? The generic name for Lantus is insulin glargine. Lantus and insulin glargine is a type of insulin. Drug class is insulin. Lantus and insulin glargine are a subcutaneous injection for diabetes. What is the generic name for Zestrel and Prinavil? What type of drugs are Zestrel and Prinavil? What do Zestrel and Prinavil treat? The generic name for Zestrel and Prinavil is lisinopril. Zestrel, Prinavil, and lisinopril are angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. Zestrel, Prinavil, and lisinopril are high blood pressure medications and also treats heart failure. The main function is to block chemicals that trigger the tightening of the blood vessels. What is the generic name for Lyrica? What type of drug is Lyrica? What does Lyrica treat? The generic name for Lyrica is pregabalin. Lyrica and pregabalin are gamma aminobutyric acid analogs. Lyrica and pregabalin are used to control seizures, are for nerve pain and fibromyalgia. Again, that's Lyrica and pregabalin. What is the generic name for Lopressor? What is the type of drug for Lopressor? What does Lopressor treat? The generic name for Lopressor is metoprolol. Lopressor and metoprolol are cardioselective beta blockers. Lopressor and metoprolol are used to treat high blood pressure, reduce heart attacks, heart failure, heart angina, or pain. Again, their names are Lopressor and metoprolol. What is the generic name for Nexium? What type of drug is Nexium? What does Nexium treat? The generic name for Nexium is esomeprazole magnesium. Nexium and esomeprazole magnesium are proton pump inhibitors. Nexium and esomeprazole magnesium are used to treat GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, and other conditions involving excessive stomach acid. That's Nexium and esomeprazole. What is the generic name for Zocor? What type of drug is Zocor? What does Zocor treat? The generic name for Zocor is simvastatin. Zocor and simvastatin are statins. Zocor and simvastatin are used to treat high cholesterol in conjunction with diet changes and help to prevent heart attacks and strokes. That would be Zocor and simvastatin. What is the generic name for Ventolin? What type of drug is Ventolin? What does Ventolin treat? The generic name for Ventolin is albuterol. Ventolin and albuterol are adrenergic bronchodilators. Ventolin and albuterol are solutions used in inhalers for asthma. What is the generic name for Vyvanse? What type of drug is Vyvanse? What does Vyvanse treat? The generic name for Vyvanse is lisdexamfetamine. Vyvanse and lisdexamfetamine is a central nervous system stimulant. Vyvanse and lisdexamfetamine are used to treat hyperactivity and impulse control disorders. That again is Vyvanse and lisdexamfetamine. That concludes the question study list.